Good morning. I am Anouk Lorie, and I'm here with a very eminent panel of people. As early as it is, I'm happy to be here with you. I'm briefly going to introduce each of you, and then before each question, we'll go into a little bit more detail as to what you do. We don't have much time, but we have some very interesting topics today. On my right is Dr. Qanta Ahmed, Mr. Tarek Fatah, Professor Peter Neumann, Dr. Matthew Levitt, and Dr. Amichai Magen. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
Okay, very broad question, but I think a very important one. Osama bin Laden killed just over 2 years ago. Are we any better or worse than we were then when you think of terrorism worldwide?
Well, I think killing of bin Laden was important, but it didn't really make a big...
Professor Neumann, I'll just
Yes.
Very quickly introduce you. You're the director of the International Center for the Study of Radicalism and Political Violence and professor of security studies at King's College London.
Exactly.
Now you're free to answer.
And it gives my answer a lot more weight now that you've said that.
Absolutely. Otherwise, you're just a talking head.
Exactly. So killing of bin Laden was important, but of course, in the meantime, a lot of other things have happened too. So we've had the consequences of the Arab Spring playing out since early 2011, and I think that will, in the long term, be much more important for the future of Al-Qaeda and for the future of jihadist terrorism than the killing of one person. So we've seen the emergence of terrorist safe havens, if you want, in Libya, in the Sinai. We have an ongoing conflict in Syria, which is threatening to produce a lot of jihadists. And so I think these developments are going to be more important as killing bin Laden was. I think in the long term, these are the developments that are going to matter.
Mm-hmm. So the Arab Spring, as Professor Neumann just mentioned, what does it mean for radicalization and for terrorism?
Well,
Matt Levitt, you're senior fellow and director at the Stein Program on Counter-Terrorism and Intelligence, the Washington Institute for Near East Policy.
Exactly. Good morning. Look, I think that the Arab Spring, the concern about the Arab Spring is that failure for governments to provide and to function is going to create oxygen for radical groups. And if they can't participate in the political system as democratic groups, and they're proving that they can't, is that going to create increased radicalism? We're already seeing beginnings of terrorist campaigns in Egypt of a kind we hadn't seen in many, many years. And then larger than that is, for me, the issue of Syria. Syria not only provides far more oxygen for Al-Qaeda and its affiliates than anything else, it's much more important from an ideological perspective, for example, than Iraq ever was. But it also goes well beyond Al-Qaeda. We have two sides of this conflict right now, and on either side of this conflict, there are bad guys.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Amichai Magen, I know you want to answer. You're senior researcher and head of political development at the International Institute for Counter-Terrorism here at the IDC, and you're also a lecturer.
Yes, thank you. I think that as this process, the so-called Arab Spring, was taking off in late 2010, beginning of 2011, the conversation certainly, I think, in policy circles and in the media was rather dichotomous. The conversation was, is this heading towards a positive process of democratization, liberalization, or is this heading towards an Islamist winter, i.e. the replacement of old forms of authoritarianism, secular, nationalist, socialist, statist, sclerotic, with a new Islamist form of authoritarianism, primarily led by the Muslim Brotherhood. As we've, in retrospect, so almost 3 years since the famous self-immolation of Ahmed Bouazizi in Tunisia, I think that we've missed until recently a much more profound trend, which has great consequences for radicalization and terrorism, not only regionally but globally, and that is the loosening and in some cases the collapse of state authority in North Africa and the Middle East. This is not an entirely new process. Somalia was always, for the last 30 years, the poster child of a failed state. Lebanon has always been weak. Yemen has been weak for a while. But really, over a very short period of time, from Libya to Sudan to Sinai, if you look at Israel's Israel's immediate strategic environment, we're pretty much surrounded, with thankfully the exception of Jordan, by weak and failed states. And that creates a security gap and a legitimacy gap and a capacity gap. All of these, and we can elaborate on each and every one of them, really create radicalization enabling conditions on what I believe to be a pretty unprecedented scale.
My colleague makes a great point, actually, as the upheaval or turbulence of the Arab awakening has opened up the vacuum for political Islamists to seize power, whether formally or informally. And, of course, we're seeing the aftermath of Egypt. But to go back to your original question, you asked about whether the assassination of bin Laden has made any difference. In my own travels in the Northwest frontier, and we'll be speaking about them today at the conference, to meet child jihadists between the age of 10 and 17, none of them had heard of Osama bin Laden. None of them knew of 9/11. So the ideologies that we might have classified this era with, just with names, characters, and actions, are so fragmented into different ideologies. But we mustn't forget the threat of non-violent political Islamists who can wreak perhaps even more havoc politically.
Mm-hmm.
I think the issue is one where we've missed out the ideological war of ideas. I think the West's view of Osama bin Laden was like a Hollywood caricature, and obviously if in 12 years you couldn't beat a group of men in caves, the starting point would be to admit to the dismal failure of the existing paradigms within which this discussion takes place. To suggest that poverty or disempowerment or the lack of statehood has anything to do with jihadi terrorism is to be completely ignorant of almost 1400 years of the jihadi ideology that is legitimized by almost every aspect of the Muslim conversation. So unless and until there is a general renunciation of the doctrine of armed jihad as espoused by the Muslim Brotherhood, that person, and I as a Muslim born in Pakistan, I can tell you, is a problem. You have a democratic state in Pakistan, you've had transfer of power, you've had at least 8 elections. To understand terrorism by not looking at Pakistan but viewing it in Egypt is, again, I'm sorry to say to the Israeli audience, I think it's very myopic of Israelis to be centered around and consider themselves as a European state, talking about terrorism and never ever touching on what is the source of terrorism. Do you think that there was a lack of democracy that led to 3 million Bangladeshis in a genocide in 1971? Do you think there was a lack of democracy or a state structure that allowed General Ziaul-Haq in Jordan to cause what is called the Black September? Mm-hmm. The massacres that have gone on in the 19th century in Iraq by the Saudis? Do you think there was a lack of state or not of state? Unless you understand the fundamental basis that the Muslim jihadi desires death as the beginning of his or her life, you're missing the debate.
Right, right. I want to just quickly expand on that, Tarek, Fatah, and Dr. Qanta, Ahmed. The idea that the idea of a democratic Islamist state, is that something that
it's a contradiction?
It's an
oxymoron.
It's an anathema.
It's there's a simple thing. Any nation state that declares itself to have a hierarchy of citizenships is by its very nature a state that does not respect human rights or the 1948 UN Declaration, Convention of Human Rights, or the Helsinki Convention on any aspect of it. Any state that considers women to be inferior, that considers gays and lesbians worthy of being killed, whether it is a democracy or not, it cannot be, it cannot be a democracy if it is guided as its fundamental principle of law, Sharia.
But that's not necessarily Islam, and I find it interesting that you both say that an Islamic democratic state is
In
something
quotation, I'm saying
that
in
cannot
quotations.
exist when you're.
I
you're
would
both
cla-
here
I
in
would
Israel,
I would
and you
clarify
both,
that.
I think,
Let
believe
me
in
just
Israel.
correct the word so that you don't put words in my mouth. An Islamist democracy cannot. It doesn't. Is an oxymoron. It doesn't make sense. I regard Pakistan, which calls itself as an Islamic republic, as an Islamist democracy. I spoke about political Islamism yesterday, and remember the quote from Erdogan. Erdogan himself said democracy is like a train which we ride until we reach our one-way destination. Another colleague has said democracy for the Islamists is like a ladder which once they reach office, they burn so nobody can follow. Pakistan is a Sunni Islamist democracy. It claims to have all the organs and architecture and structure of democracy, but it does not afford equal representation to anyone that is not accepted to be officially state-sanctioned a Muslim. Democracy requires championship of pluralism and protection of those who are politically disenfranchised or vulnerable, and we don't see that. We don't see that in the world's first Muslim democracy any more than we see the other country where I've lived, Saudi Arabia, which does not claim to be a democracy but has theocratic Wahhabi neo-orthodoxy as its measure. So those two ideologies, which are prevalent in the Muslim majority world, even in Turkey, which is markedly becoming more and more Islamist, are not compatible with what it means to be a democracy. Here in Israel, my Israeli friends and colleagues have told me two things. They call Israel a secular democracy and others call it a Jewish democracy. But what I know is minorities that are living in Israel have enormous manifestation of personal rights in a way that I don't see in Muslim majority worlds, and I've published about that.
Right, that's very interesting.
So I'm not talking about what someone might say is an Islamic democracy. I'm saying Islamist democracy is like saying a totalitarian democracy. It doesn't exist. It cannot function.
Just to clarify, there is no such thing as an Islamic state or an Islamist state. There has never been an Islamic state in all of Islam's history. The Umayyads were a dynasty. The fact that it was formed by the enemies of Prophet Muhammad is lost on many scholars. The Abbasides were a monarchy. The Mughals were a monarchy. The Ottoman Caliphate was a colonial state, ruled over Arabs for 600 years. So anyone from the Muslim Brotherhood, from Hassan al-Banna to Sayyid Maududi of Qutb, that have today introduced the concept of creating an Islamic state, a manifestation of that in the 20th century was the literally dissecting of India and creating an Islamic state by British and American help, has proven to be an utter failure. And as long as this concept is not attacked, you will keep on feeding jihadism, Islamic terrorism, terrorism of all sorts, because you're never addressing the fundamental issue that we in public discourse, where in the United States we cannot call Islamic extremism. And General Abu Zaid yesterday talked about the restrictions on speech in democracy. So all of this political correctness, I would also call white liberal guilt, has led to an entire industry that has grown that is quite comfortable with the continuing of terrorism, because not a single person that I have seen has said that Pakistan, being the source of international terrorism, should be under sanctions. Yet Iran is under sanctions, and we don't really hear of Iranian suicide bombers running around in New York.
Right. I want to, obviously all eyes are on Syria, and history is fascinating. I wish we had hours to discuss and go back into history, because obviously it's a several thousand-year-old issue. But Syria, Professor Neumann, do you think that, considering what you know about Syria, is there still a chance for a non-radical Islamist opposition to take power of the opposition?
Well, right now it's very difficult to see, because we're looking at an opposition that we're always focusing on the jihadists, but even what we typically describe as the mainstream parts of the opposition, though perhaps not Salafist and Al-Qaedaist, they are still Islamists. And so genuinely what we always describe, or what John Kerry describes as the moderate secular parts of the opposition, you can count on two hands. I mean, it's a really small part of that opposition. But I think that's also been part of the outcome of the failure of the West to embrace that opposition. If you get all your money and your support and your weapons from Qatar and from Saudi Arabia, then you shouldn't be surprised that these people are trying to please their paymasters and start to look like them.
But Professor, the United States of America placated the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. President Obama bent over 90 degrees to kiss the hand of the Saudi king. American ambassador in Cairo, Madam Patterson, literally became a spokesperson of the Muslim Brotherhood, and look where it ended. As long as America feeds the hand of the Muslim Brotherhood and then says we need to fight terrorism, it's basically funding the military-industrial complex and the experts and consultants in Washington that say somehow we can convince the Muslim Brotherhood to act in a democracy. It's not. Sayyid Qutb's followers want to dominate the world.
But in Syria, you saw the opposite playing out, namely America or the West being largely passive, and the outcome also being a very Islamized
There's
opposition.
an incompetent President Obama's. 2 years ago, he could have solved the problem. Now it is too late to solve.
I don't think 2 years ago he could have solved the problem. I think that this has been mishandled. But I think that to say the United States was supporting the Muslim Brotherhood is going a stretch too far. They didn't do enough to contend with it, that's for certain. But
still in Syria they're
But Tarek, to focus on her question on Syria, I think that there are more non-Islamists within the opposition that some account for. Not as many as we'd hope, but there are some. To me, the bigger problem is that they are all bosses. There is no de Gaulle. There's no one person who is able to unite everybody because everybody sees themselves as de Gaulle. I compare it to Fatah in the 2006 elections where they all ran against each other and therefore Hamas won in places like Qalqilia where 5 or 6 Fatah candidates all ran against each other and a Hamas militant who was in jail became the mayor. Within the FSA, that's the biggest problem. And the problem for us as an international community is that if we don't find a way to find moderates within the FSA that we can work with, that we can arm and we can help, by default, the Salafi jihadis will continue to be not only the best armed, but the best capable, and therefore with tangible results on the ground, very, very well placed to be in a position of power when things end, however they drag out.
I mean, in many ways, we always want grassroots revolutions. We want things happening from the ground up. And that's to some extent what happened in Syria. And the outcome is that you have a lot of local people who are not necessarily led by anyone. And they are arguing all the time. And you have local coordination committees who came up from the ground. There's no national leadership for the opposition. And we're now complaining about that fact.
I mean, clearly we're not facing a good set of possibilities in Syria. I don't see the prospects of a Jeffersonian democracy evolving there anytime soon. I think that a big question before us is whether any one faction can re-establish on a monopoly on the use of large-scale organized violence. And I think that the scale of destruction and dislocation in Syria over the past 2.5 years, and here I think it is reasonable to fault the West for not seeing the differences between Libya, where there was a sharp intervention, the country was able to recover relatively. It's not doing great, but we haven't seen the kind of devastation of the infrastructure, and whoever comes to power in Syria, it will, even if they're the most competent, organized government in the world, it will take decades for that country to be reconstructed, if that's at all a possibility. I think the more likely
it stays one country.
Exactly. I think the more likely scenario is the fragmentation of Syria into a variety of statelets, partly governed territories, contested both from the inside and from the outside, with potentially a tremendous amount of ethnic violence and broad regional ramifications. The Kurds in the northeast, the Alawites in the northwest, contending Sunni forces, Druze, Christians, anybody who could leave will leave. We're really facing possibly a sort of Somali or a sort of an Afghanistan right here on the border between Jordan and Israel and Lebanon.
But why wouldn't people consider the question of a free Kurdistan? Why is one area occupied by 4 Muslim countries, Turkey, Syria, Iran, and Iraq, never espouses the same emotional response to say there are people under occupation for 85 years? Why shouldn't the Kurds of Syria want to be in a Kurdistan with the Kurds of Iraq or the Kurds of Turkey or the Kurds of Iran? They've almost forgotten they have a more legitimate right as an independent state than either Syria or Jordan in the straight-line border states that they have become. And Jordan, by the way, oppresses its people far more than is given credit to, and is a dictatorship of the highest order simply because it has a king that speaks very fluent British English. Everybody thinks he's moderate. He's a vicious dictator of his own sort, and he's got the most moderate people in Jordan are the Muslim Brotherhood.
It's not surprising that when we talk about terrorism, these panels tend to have kind of like a doomsday feel to them. So I want to go, again, we don't have that much time, but sometimes that's useful because we have to go to bullet points. You're all experts in terrorism, Islam. What do you think the West can do to counter terrorism and radical Islamism in the Middle East and North Africa?
Really, I don't have a single isolated point, but perhaps the most important thing for anyone who's writing about this or explaining to it in the public or trying to interpret events is to understand the very real distinction between political Islamists and Muslims, and to understand that political Islamism is an ideologically totalitarian politic which is disguised as a religion, and certainly in the United States where I live, often privileged like a religion, which enables it to evade scrutiny. I think that's one of the most important areas to discuss and focus on, and it will help counter all kinds of terrorism if we unveil political Islamism for what it is.
You're not jumping to talk as soon
We'll just go in order to make it clear.
As soon as we're talking about, solutions, which is always interesting. No,
surely there is a solution. You got to start from the bottom. If you are going to avoid any discussion about the cancer of Islamism, and if the United States government and the NYPD and the FBI and the Defense Department have influence of Muslim Brotherhood within their ranks, we've already lost the war. Within the Obama administration, there are people clearly with affiliation with the Muslim Brotherhood. This is the first time that an American president has sent a message of congratulations to the Islamic Society of North America, Indiana-based Muslim Brotherhood affiliate in the Texas terror funding trial. ISNA came out as an unindicted co-conspirator. And yet President Obama is sending congratulatory messages. Within his administration, look at Ambassador Rashad Hassan to the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Countries, pro-Muslim Brotherhood. His speechwriter who wrote the speech in Cairo, pro-Muslim Brotherhood. How can you fight your enemy when the enemy is able to define the language that the Americans use and curtail any criticism of jihad? No reference ever. Even Bush ends up saying, well, Islam is a peaceful religion. Sure it is. But why can't you say that Islamism and jihad, as pronounced by the Muslim Brotherhood, is a cancer that we will fight and defeat? Without that, you can't win it.
Professor Neumann?
I think, this is probably more boring than what my predecessors have said or the other speakers, but I think it's really important that you, as a government or as the West, that you try to avoid ungoverned spaces, especially in countries that are now in turmoil. We see this happening in Egypt. We see it happening in Libya. We see it in a couple of other places because these ungoverned spaces always attract Al-Qaeda, and it gives them a sanctuary from where they can organize, operate. And we know that the most sophisticated plots, terrorist plots like 9/11, were only possible because they had a base where they could organize freely and operate. And by closing down these sanctuaries, you're already dealing with a good chunk of very serious plots. It's not, a solution of the underlying causes of the problem,
Sure.
but you're dealing with the terrorist aspect of it to some extent.
But they did it in Hamburg.
Yes, well, but, it was coordinated from
Yes.
Afghanistan, but,
Yes, of course. Yes.
No, I'm with Peter. In terms of things that can actually be done to make the world a safer place, I think you have to think a little bit strategically. In the first instance, I'm former FBI and other U.S. government things. I can tell you, I think that since 9/11, we collectively in the West have gotten much better at tactical counterterrorism. There's no such thing as 100% preventing all plots, but we've gotten better at figuring out how to identify and what to do to try and get a handle on that. Where we are still in the infantile stages is in strategic counterterrorism, in countering violent extremism, in trying to move the needle early in the process. So we intervene at a process where someone is beginning to be along the path of radicalization to violence rather than waiting until they get to that point. In the United States, this is still overseen by FBI, Homeland Security, the offices of the U.S. attorneys. That's law enforcement. That's too late. If it's a law enforcement problem already, then they're already radicalized, and that's too late. We don't have the government infrastructure right now to deal with that at the federal level, which is why I and others are pushing for this to be done between independent groups, NGOs, and state and local governments in the United States in the first instance. In the second instance, and some of our discussion today I think has underlined this, people make the mistake all the time of talking about terrorism as such. There's lots of different terrorisms out there. You can't discuss in the same breath what should you do about Al-Qaeda core, what should you do about any particular affiliate. There are differences that make a difference. There are commonalities, to be sure, especially at the ideological level, but there are differences that make a difference. Not only among the Sunni radical groups, not only among the Al-Qaeda affiliates, but we also need to remember there are other groups out there. Hezbollah, for example, is on the rise, and I mention it not only because it's really important, but because I just wrote a book about it, and I want people to buy it.
And obviously awareness around Hezbollah, is on our doorstep, so it's definitely interesting. Dr. Magen?
Yeah, no, I think the first thing we need to understand is that this is an historic process. It's not going to end tomorrow, and we need to understand that it's an historic process, perhaps on par with a 30-year war in Europe, that reshaped Europe.
Are you talking specifically about the Arab Spring?
I'm talking about the processes that are sweeping at least parts of North Africa and the Middle East today, and we need to understand the systemic nature of this crisis. Just like democratization processes do not happen randomly, state failure and the kind of processes that we see around us do not happen randomly. There is a cascade, there is a regional element to this, and a state like Syria can infect Jordan, Lebanon, and so on and so forth. So we need to understand the systemic and historical nature of this crisis and deal with it on that. Think about this in sort of in a grand strategic level. The so-called pivot of American security attention away from the Middle East and towards Asia is not helping in that regard. The second thing we need to understand is that whereas 5 or 6, 7 years ago we spoke about promoting democracy in the Middle East, today we should be conscious about preserving the few islands of stability that are still there. And I say this with great sadness and reluctance as someone who's just brought out a second edition of his book with Thomas Risse and Michael McFaul, who's now serving as the US ambassador in Russia, on American and European democracy promotion efforts over the last decades. I do think it is important that we make a distinction between those Arab states, primarily Tunisia and Egypt, that have made at least an initial transition to at least one reasonably free and fair election. And here, the goal of Western diplomacy needs to be to keep politics open. Democratic elections do change societies for the better, but only if they're free, fair, and periodical. If it's a case of one man, one vote, one time, and then things clump down, either the military comes in or the Islamists come in and dismantle the infrastructure of democracy, then promoting democracy is almost counterproductive, and we can understand why. So in those countries that have made a transition to democracy, where there is an institutional infrastructure, and those countries do exist in the Middle East, we need to focus on keeping politics open. Where that transition has not happened, especially in those dire cases where we have severe cases of civil war and state failure, we need to contain that. And we need to come up with new counterinsurgency and the development policies to address that. Our state-building efforts, Michael McFaul, my friend and colleague from Stanford, always says, look, the United States has a great institution for regime destruction. It's called the Pentagon. But we don't have comparable institutions for regime construction. We don't know how to do it. We don't know how to do state building and democracy promotion in the long term to do it very well. And if the struggle becomes sufficiently critical to our national security and survival of Western security interests, I believe it will steer us in the direction towards developing these new institutional capacities, from the tactical to the strategic. And just a final point, the best way to promote moderation, liberalism, economic growth and democracy is to be functional, successful democracies ourselves. If we abandon Western values, if we surrender global leadership, if we cease to show a very strong connection between liberal values, liberal democracy, economic success, and military power, we've lost the game.
But then you're supporting Saudi Arabia.
No, I'm not.
No.
You dropped the democracy there.
Yes, no. When you're saying statehood, states that are stable need to be secured. The democracy that is functioning is Bangladesh. And by identifying terrorism as a Middle East issue, you're again missing the boat.
Bangladesh doesn't feature very highly
Why
on the ranks of
It has
of
more
democracy.
terrorists coming out who are fighting in Afghanistan and in Al-Qaeda and in Syria.
Yeah, but that's my point.
But it's a failing democracy.
It's not a failing democracy. How is it a failing democracy? It has 3 elections. It is the only Islamic country where secularism has been imbibed in the constitution. Is facing Al-Qaeda and the Lashkar-e-Tayyiba, undermining it by the Pakistan ISI. It features nowhere in the Western world because everyone is blinded by saying this is the Middle East issue. We will not discuss India, where there are tens of thousands of people dying, where in Kashmir there is 500,000 men across the border. We simply stop at Iran, and anything east of Iran, we are simply blind to it. And that's where terrorism is coming out from. And simply because the curriculum doesn't allow us to study Bangladesh, it's preposterous to say that the one Islamic country where there has been repeated elections, a secular democracy, a pro-Western prime minister who's a woman, who's fighting jihadis, and in the constitution says if you are Jamaat-e-Islami, you cannot run for the polls, the West has no idea about it. Not a single New York Times article, op-ed written about it. Why? They don't have the Taj Mahal for the reporters to go and visit.
Tarek, you should write that op-ed.
I've written.
Yeah.
I've written.
Okay, in the op-ed, we'll have to read it in your op-ed because we have to stop because you're both actually going to a panel where we can continue to hear you. Thank you so much. I didn't introduce the both of you, so I'll quickly do that. Dr. Qanta Ahmed is Associate Professor of Medicine at the State University of New York and a Templeton Cambridge Journalism Fellow in Science and Religion at the University of Cambridge. And Mr. Tarek Fatah is the founder of the Muslim Canadian Congress in Canada, and you're a writer and a journalist, so we can read and hear what you say in other panels. I want to thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Have a great day, and I wish you luck because we all depend on it.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.